Why do we seem more unhappy than ever before, despite having more freedom, choice, and materials than ever before?
So life is funny that way. Um, I there's a lot of answers that people give you, and I tended to believe all of them until I was visiting a friend of mine, actually, this who struck it rich. He's doing incredibly well, and you know, living in this amazing apartment, cooks here, maids there, and I just remember thinking, your life is totally over the top. And when I pointed that out to him, he's like, "Yeah, but I'm not any happier." I was like, "How could that possibly be?" And he starts listing off this litany of complaints. The cook can't get along with the maid, and my daughter didn't get into the fancy kindergarten that we were hoping for, this kind of stuff. And I remember feeling really superior to him and thinking, if I had that kind of cash, I would appreciate it. I would, wallow in it. I would recognize that I've got such a good thing going in life. And then several years later, I was reading Frank Marlowe's wonderful book on the Hadza, who are some of the world's last remaining hunter-gatherers. And as I was reading this book, they own so little, only what they can carry. They have to share everything because they're always on the edge of starvation. So anyone who has a successful hunt is required to share it with the group. They bury almost half their children before they reach adulthood because they live in a pre-medical society. The list just goes on, and I and if anything, they're happier than we are. And so when I was reading that, I was like, holy crap, I am just like Steve. I'm a multimillionaire by comparison to these people, but I'm not any happier to them we aren't any happier than they are on average. In fact, if anything, they're happier than we are. And that just got me rethinking everything. Like, how could that possibly be?
Hmm. Do you think more money perhaps deteriorates someone's ability to connect with others?
Well, not necessarily. And we do know there's the funny thing about money is that the Easterlin paradox taught us that as society gets richer, people don't get happier. So if you take, for example, the United States or Western Europe, and you track over the last 50 years, society is about four times richer in real dollars. Getting rid of inflation, people can buy four times as much as they used to. But they're no happier. When they track happiness, it hasn't changed at a societal level. On the other hand, when you look at rich people, they're happier than poor people. And that holds whatever time you look. So if you look at, for example, Rothschild, who was the richest human on the planet in the late 1800s, he went to the doctor because he had a boil on his back. Now, first of all, in industrialized countries, you don't get boils anymore. And when he got to the doctor's office, he got the doctor lanced it with a dirty needle because he didn't understand germs and killed him. And so the richest guy on earth had this medical treatment that would get him sued in the worst clinic in anywhere that you'd ever possibly want to live, and yet he would have been happier than poor people because everything is relative, right? If you have more than other people, you're higher in status, and so we still see the same thing today, that rich people on average do better than poor people do, but they on average, the whole society is less happy than the Hazar. And so I don't think that money per se is our problem. What I think the problem is that we live in a world that is now a mismatch for our evolutionary goals. And our two most important goals are intention. One of them is connection, and the other is autonomy, this desire to drive our own engine, to be in charge of ourselves. And I think the balance between those two has gotten out of whack.
Hmm. What evolutionary function do those two things serve?
So about 6 million years ago, we separated from our chimp cousins when the Great African Rift Valley had widened out far enough, and the east side of the Rift Valley had risen up in height because I don't fully understand the geology of it, but this upwelling that occurs underneath the mantle there. And as a consequence, all those sort of proto-chimpanzees who lived across the rainforest in this entire area, the ones who lived on the right side of the Rift Valley suddenly had no choice but to leave the trees because there weren't enough trees anymore. Not suddenly, it took many millions of years for this to happen, but they started getting forced more and more frequently out of the trees until eventually around 6 million years ago, they basically had to leave them for good. So what did our ancestors do? Well, chances are good they would never have made it at all, but we got lucky and somehow they did. And the way that what the data suggests is they did it by cooperating, by becoming far more connected to each other than our chimpanzee cousins are. And so humans are fundamentally a cooperative species. Chimps are fundamentally competitive. And my favorite piece of evidence for that is if you look at our eyes. Chimps are very clever. They can see the direction of your gaze. And so they can see if you look down and to the left. But they disguise that information by having entirely brown eyes. And what that means is that they don't want other members of the group to know what's attracted their attention, because the other members might compete with them to try to get it first if it's good, or run away and leave them to suffer if it's bad. But humans, we've evolved away from that with these white sclera to our eyes, which means that when we look over at something, we advertise the direction of our gaze, which says, if I let my fellow group members know what's attracted my attention, if it's a good thing, they'll help me get it. If it's a bad thing, they'll help me deal with it. And so that fundamental orientation changed between them and us. And that's our most fundamental drive, is this need for connection, which we evolved when we left the trees, and suddenly we were at risk of predation by all sorts of animals that aren't relevant to chimpanzees. So that's our single most fundamental need, this need to cooperate and connect with each other. The next most fundamental need, though, is this need for autonomy, this need to drive our own bus, to be self-governing, to be in charge of our future. And I believe the reason for that is that autonomy allows you to decide where you have the best prospects. Well, what can I do to become a success in life? Because you know what you enjoy, you know what you'll spend time working on. And so autonomy allows you to say, well, people think I'm pretty good at this. Let me give it a try. Or maybe I don't really enjoy it, though, so I'll give this a try instead. And what that does, of course, it allows you to self-develop and to become more valuable to your group. So the irony is, in the end, autonomy is really in service of connection, but of course it's at loggerheads with connection. Those two needs are in permanent tension with one another.
And how does a modern world affect our ability to connect? I'm guessing it's in negative ways.
Yeah, it's in negative ways. You're right. So the problem is that if you think about it, if I want to be self-governing and you and I are buddies and you say, hey, let's go see a movie tonight. I'm like, oh, I actually wanted to go, pizza and bowling. Well, either I can sacrifice our relationship and I can do what I want, you can do what you want, or I can sacrifice what I want and we can find a compromise. And so entering relationships mandates that you sacrifice some autonomy, and sacrificing pursuing autonomy mandates you sacrifice relationships. So if I say, sorry, mate, I'm going to go off and go bowling and have a pizza, well, then we're not going to be as tight anymore if I keep doing that over time. And so these two needs are constant tension with each other. Well, our ancestors, they lived lives that where connection was guaranteed. They had no choice. They couldn't just wander off into the woods because they'd get eaten. And so they were tightly bonded to one another. And although in principle they're very egalitarian societies, if the whole group decides when it's time to split, to change camp, to go south, I can't just go north. I'm going to be lion food. I have to either persuade you guys to go north with me or suck it up and go south with you. And so what I think happened is that opportunities for true autonomy were rare for our ancestors. And when they were so rare, and they were so valuable that when they were around, they grabbed them. It's a little bit like fat, salt, and sugar. Our ancestors out in the savannah had nowhere near enough fat, salt, and sugar. So whenever they're around, they just grabbed it, even if they're not hungry. It's super hard to turn down a bag of potato chips, whether you're hungry or not, right? And that's because we evolved to eat them when they're there. But now, of course, there's too much of it. And I think the same thing has happened with autonomy. We used to have this balance that emphasized connection because we couldn't live without it. Well, now I can live without connection. I can drone in my food. My coffee's on Amazon. I don't ever need to leave my apartment. I can live by myself and just do everything I need on the internet and work remotely. And so this balance has shifted really dramatically in favor of autonomy, doing things where I can pursue opportunities, with the result that we've sacrificed our relationships over time. And there's lots of great evidence to show that we've really minimize relationships, even in just the last 50 years.
When did this start? When did we start skewing too far towards autonomy and away from connection?
Well, there's not a single starting point, but I would say that you can imagine the shift to agriculture, which about 10,000 years ago would do it. But of course, early agriculture required enormous cooperation in order to bring in the crops and things like that. And then the earliest cities, which are about 5,000 years ago, also were very clan-based, and you don't just choose an occupation. If your dad's a baker, you're a baker. And so, again, there's a lot of rules and a lot of obligations that society is all about connection. But starting in about 1840, in the United States, and around 1900 in the rest of the world, people began moving to cities en masse. And cities started to change their character. They were no longer the kinds of places where the same family had lived there for generations in the same neighborhoods and everybody knew each other. Now, it took time to disrupt that. Even into the 1950s and 60s, we still see people showing a lot of residential stability in cities, but cities started to fill up. And so in 1840, about 10% of all humanity lived in cities. By 1960, it was 33%. It was 1 in 3, gone from 1 in 10 to 1 in 3. By 2007, it was actually 50-50. And so as the world starts shifting to cities, well, city dwellers just don't need their neighbors as much anymore. They don't even necessarily know their neighbors despite living cheek by jowl with them. And especially with the kind of residential mobility that we now see where people pursue job opportunities and move around, cities have lost that structure whereby people used to spend time with each other. And so I think the breakdown can be traced most clearly to this time. Now, mind you, lots of good things came of it. When it used to be, for example, if you look at hunter-gatherers, marriage was something you did because you loved each other and you wanted to form a bond and a relationship. Once you get to agriculture, well, now you're linking families together, and they're families that are typically on the brink of starvation. And so those marriage relationships are super important economic relationships. You can't just divorce. And so hunter-gatherers divorce and remarry all the time. Farmers never do. And it wasn't until we moved to cities that people started to rethink that marriage became a romantic thing and became for love again, because it wasn't just a bond between people who live in the countryside. So lots of great stuff comes of it, but that's the point at which we start to see we start to overemphasize autonomy at the expense of connection.
And do you think, well, the last 20 years and perhaps maybe the next 10 years has been an accelerated skew away from connection and towards autonomy with things like social media? We've got AI now. Do you think now we're kind of accelerating unless we kind of pump the brakes?
Yeah, we seem to be. So if you look at time spent alone, and the problem is that in all those time spent surveys, alone could mean that you're on a screen. You might be texting with your friends. We don't know that you're truly alone. And in fact, I think you're not. I think the reason time spent alone is going up is you're scrolling through Instagram, texting with your friends, but you're not with them. If you look at time spent alone, it's increased dramatically. It's more than doubled in the past 10 years for certain age demographics. It's increased for all of us, but for people who are under 25, I think that's the data, maybe as high as 29, it's actually more than doubled. Time spent alone. And then once you're over 30, it's about 30% more. As you get older and older and you're just less tech savvy, you see less and less of an effect of these changes. And they're dramatic. And as you say, social media plays a big part of that. It's, 10, 15 years now that they started to have basically full market penetration. And so we can now see that people are spending much, much more time alone. Now, the pandemic spiked. It went back down to pandemic, but it's now returned to pandemic levels and even slightly higher.
Okay. And do you think that knowing what's going on around the globe is also having a deteriorating effect? Because I think, well, evolutionary speaking, we're only meant to know what's going on in our small kind of group, our small community, but to know what's going on halfway around the world and to know the horrors that's going on halfway around the world, that can't be good for us.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. So if you look at the state of the world today, and let's just compare it to 150 years ago. 150 years ago, 90% of the world was in poverty, abject poverty. 90% of the world was illiterate. By any metric that you use, life was comparatively short. By any metric you use, the world was a pretty miserable place compared to today. It was way better than 10,000 years ago, but it was horrible compared to where we are now. The difference between where we are now, though, is that, yes, there's still a lot of conflict. Unfortunately, that's human nature. And now we're aware of it instantaneously, and we're aware of the human toll, and we can see it in front of us on our television or our laptop. And so the world feels like a more dangerous place when, in fact, it's a way safer place. If you look at any measure of risk, going out in the late 1800s, going to a fish and chips shop in Oxford was more dangerous than it was to hang out on a corner in Detroit during the worst of the crack epidemic, because the fish and chips killed you at a higher rate than you were killed by warring gangs over crack because of food poisoning. There was so many things that killed us back in those times that life just seemed chaotic. It didn't seem safe like it does now. And the problem is once it's gotten really safe, then the bad things that do happen stand out in really sharp relief. And of course that's where we are today, where you don't just read about a war 3 months after it started by a newspaper slowly getting to you on a boat. You see the war in real time from the safety, of your home, and it's shocking.
Do you think that's why so many people are so cynical? Maybe they don't see that this is, in the West anyway, one of the best time, well, the best time to be alive. They maybe don't see the progress as much, or maybe too focused on the negative.
Yeah, I think it's, Steve Pinker and a bunch of people talk about how negative makes the news and very slow progress never does. Nobody ever opened the newspaper and said, over the last 150 years, literacy rates are gone from 10% to 90 some percent. Nobody says that. Nobody says starvation rates are down, et cetera, because the good news happens really, really slowly. And so you can end up just believing that we have problems that we don't have. You can end up doubting this whole project, the Enlightenment and our belief in individual human rights and our belief in democracies. And all these things are just based on our shared understanding that this is a great way of life. And when right now, even though it's a particularly violent moment in time, because if you look at what's happened in Ukraine and Gaza and Sudan, the list is long, it's still way less violent than if you pick any random Monday here. Yeah, I guess Monday there as well now. You pick any random Monday 150 years ago, and I promise you there was a lot, percentage-wise, there was a lot more death and mayhem. Even just interpersonal crime. If you take, for example, the United States in 1972, and you set murder and rape you call whatever their rates are 100, you call them each 100. They're not the same, but you just call them 100. And then you track it over the next 50 years. You see that murders drop by more than half and rape has dropped by more than 3/4. And it's not just, you could say, well, it's reporting, but reporting goes the other way. In 1972, it was very difficult to report a rape. Your chances of being believed were much lower than they are today. And so we know that the effect is even larger than that. But you wouldn't know it if you look at the internet or TV or any of those things, because the violence and with billions of humans, there's still lots of violence and mayhem, and it's just too easy to see and too easy to therefore believe that the world's going to hell in a handbasket.
Do you read the news or watch the news at all?
I do sometimes. I'm a keen watcher or reader of the news, but sometimes I can't bear to do it because it does upset me, and I can't control it. And I don't want to. Everyone has their own politics, but it upsets me when I watch people in America being rounded up by immigration agents and thrown into prisons and things who've been living this sort of, admittedly they're not documented. They arrived illegally, but they've been living a law-abiding life. And that kind of thing really throws me for a loop. And I can't fix it. And so I just as soon not immerse myself in it.
What function do you think the traditional pillars of our society serve? So religion, politics could be one as well. What function do they serve, or are we moving too far? Well, politics probably not, but religion, we're moving further and further away from religion, becoming more secular. What function does that serve, or what's that doing to us as well?
Yeah, so religious people, this is a really interesting effect. Religious people are happier than non-religious people, and more importantly than just being religious, although you already get an effect there, and we don't fully understand the effect, but I believe that it has to do with our understanding that our life has meaning. And so people who have religion believe that their life has meaning. Some higher power created them for a purpose. Whereas people who don't have religion, some of them believe their life has meaning, but many of them don't. They see themselves as this kind of speck in this kind of random process. And that can make you less happy. But their bigger effect is not just being religious, but rather attending religious services. And so religious services were a glue that held society together, and in very interesting ways. For example, if you take a look at people who never go to services versus attend services more than once a week, so at least twice a week, and you look at how happy they are, the poorest tenth of the United States who goes to religious services more than once a week is happier than the richest tenth of society that never goes to church at all. The effect is so big. And interestingly, the effect of going to services, although it makes poor people a lot happier, it makes rich people happier still. And the data suggests that rich people have separated themselves from their neighbors over the last 50 years in a way that poor people have not. And the one group of rich people that are protected from that effect are those who are highly religious, who believe that a higher power wants them to go to services regularly. And in so doing, they're, of course, forced to socialize regularly, which if you're wealthy, you have no need to do. You can create your own universe.
Is there a secular alternative to religious services?
So there used to be across Europe and particularly in the United States, all these social clubs that often served a kind of philanthropic role as well. They would raise money for causes that they believed in. And well-to-do Americans went to those. Poor Americans didn't. They couldn't afford the time away. On the other hand, poor Americans have always been more tightly connected to their neighbors. And so if you look at how much time people spend with their neighbors, poorer people spend more time with them than richer people do, in large part because poor people live in this interdependent network with their neighbors where they rely on each other. I can't afford to fix my lawnmower when it breaks, so I'll borrow yours. You can't afford to have a dog sitter, so you ask me if you can drop the dog off today for the afternoon for whatever reason. Rich people hire all that stuff out. And so the upshot is that rich people benefit more when they're forced to socialize in these kinds of ways than poor people do because they have these. They otherwise don't have these networks. Now, in the 1950s, Americans in particular, but Europeans as well, often were members of these social clubs, and those have basically died. And so the trick, of course, is can we find something that replaces them? Because they play an important role in society in getting, not just at the individual level, I think it's terribly important because we need to socialize. That's what we evolved to do. But they're also important at a societal level and people mixing and sharing ideas and talking to one another rather than just trying to live in separate worlds that become echo chambers.
Have you found any demographics or cultural groups that deviate from the norm of this movement away from connection and towards autonomy? Is there any ones that go the opposite way or that have found that perfect balance?
Well, I don't know of any going the opposite way. That's a great question. It's possible. I haven't seen it. What I do know though is that when you look at this problem is the worst. This moving away from connection and overemphasizing autonomy is worst among wealthy, urban, educated Westerners. And so that's the worst category. Westerners, by which I mean Europe, United States, Australia. If you're less wealthy, if you're less urban, if you're less educated, and if you live in non-Western countries, you're actually often doing just fine. And so there's this publicly available survey called the World Value Survey that questions people from dozens of countries around the globe. And you can see that this problem is unique among those who are doing particularly well. Lots of parts of the globe haven't become so isolated. They're not so independent. They still rely heavily on each other. Sadly, they tend to be poorer. They tend to be rural, often farming communities and things like that. But in those communities, people are connected. They may not have everything they want materially, but they've got everything that they want socially.
And how would you... Is there anything practically we can do to rebalance our lives, rebalance the kind of connection autonomy seesaw?
Yeah, so the key in my mind is that, look, we're just busier now than we've ever been before. There's so many opportunities for entertainment. There's so many ways that you can get your work done. There's so many things that make us busy that people are just not willing or able, really, to take out huge amounts of time and do the kinds of things that we used to do, socializing. Think about a world where there's only 2 or 3 channels on the television, movies only come out on occasion, and they're at the movie theater. The list is long that there's just not much in the way of entertainment. And the games that exist are these board games like Monopoly, where you just go around and around a board and it's only luck. They're nothing like the magical video games that are available today. So the world is just a lot slower and more relaxed. And in that world, sure, we got together with our friends a lot. Now, we don't live in that world anymore. So then you have to say, all right, we're just not going to go on a Thursday night to our Elks Club meeting and put on a funny hat and get together with our friends. It's just not going to happen. And once you accept that, then you say, all right, well, what can we do in order to fix this process? And for me, I think the key is something that I discovered about myself during COVID, which is, the world's kind of locked down. I'm not socializing nearly as much as I used to be face to face. I've got to find ways to replace it. And so I just looked at every single thing that I was doing alone and I said, all right, do I have to do that alone? And for example, I really enjoy doing the New York Times crossword puzzle. Now, on Monday, it's relatively easy, and by Saturday, Sunday, it's quite hard. And by Thursday, I'm personally struggling. I can't answer it very well anymore. My sister also really likes to do the puzzle. Now, she lives in London. I live in Australia. But that means that when she wakes up in the morning and makes her coffee, my working day is basically done. And so she gives me a call, and we, starting on Thursday and working our way through Sunday, and we just do the crossword puzzle together. And so we chit chat while we're doing it. We catch up with each other, loosely idle chit chat. And now we're both doing what we want to do. We're doing the crossword anyway. We're not taking extra time out of our day, but we're making sure that we connect over an activity that we both want to do. And for me, that's the golden ticket. Find ways to connect while you're doing the things that you want to do anyway. Now, if you're lucky, someone you care about, like I really love my sister, someone you care about like that will want to do the same thing that you want to do. But if you're less lucky, you have to find that person. So if I enjoy painting and I don't know anyone else likes to paint, well, why not join a studio? Do something that will allow me to paint side by side with others, and maybe that we'll become friends, but at least we'll be socializing to some degree.
Mm. How worried are you about one, dating apps, and you've got the rising loneliness amongst young men, rises in pornography addiction in young men having less sex, young men speaking to women less, small number becoming very resentful about women. How worrying is that to you?
I mean, that's very worrying. Societies don't do well when men are disgruntled and single. Societies do well when men are happy and married. That's what it tames men. Testosterone goes down when you partner up, and it goes down further when you have children. And your energies become directed toward things that society would like you to be doing rather than the risk-taking, violent things society doesn't want you to do. So it's a problem. I think a big part of that problem is our shift from dating where you meet people at the gym or at school or at your job or at a bar, meeting in person, to meeting online. And part of the reason for that is that when you meet in person, especially if you get to know them over time, then even if you might not have the features that look like you're just the kind of person everyone's after, you might have other features that are actually really lovely and that people come to know you. Oh, wow, I didn't think much of Bill when I first saw him across the bar having his Wednesday ale, but now I realize he's really a fun guy, great sense of humor, whatever. And it's very hard to do that online. And so the consequence is that when you look at online dating apps like Tinder and Hinge, it doesn't matter which one you look at, what you see is that men live in this very unequal world. It's like the equivalent of South Africa or Peru, where a small percentage of people have all the money and everybody else is basically poor. So about 20% of men on these programs get 80% of women's attention. And the other 80% of men are almost being ignored. They're hardly being swiped right at all. So that's bad for that 80% of men. It's harder for them to get a date than it used to be if they, met in face-to-face in other contexts. On the other hand, women live in Denmark. They're living in this very equal society where basically all women get swiped right. And so they get lots of attention. But the problem is they want these guys that all the other women want. And when you can imagine what happens if you're a guy who every single woman is swiping right, you're not going to settle down. You're not going to have just one partner. And so it ends up being a situation where pretty much everyone's unhappy. And I think we're kind of at the worst of it. If I had to bet money, I'd say that dating apps are well aware of this problem. They're trying to figure out how to fix it, and they will fix it. And so somebody who's currently can't seem to find a way to express who they are and why they're attractive, the new apps, social apps, are going to get made that allow us to get to know each other in the more the old-fashioned way, so we don't end up with this world where a small percentage of men are getting all the attention and no one's happy as a consequence. Well, except them, of course.
What differences are there between what men and women look for? Because there's data suggesting financially women tend to look for either men that make the same or above them. I know, if you talk about dating apps, I know that probably that 20% of men that are getting all of the swipe rights are probably over 6 foot, or at least they say they're over 6 foot on the dating apps. Is there anything else that men and women are looking for?
So women, if you think about what are the challenges that men and women face in raising, in creating and raising children, that's where sex, that's the point of sex, that's the point of romantic, that's the point of dating, that's what we evolved to do, to um, those men and women who behaved in ways on the dating market, so to speak, back 100,000 years ago, 200,000 years ago, the ones who did the things that made them have the most children who survived to adulthood, those habits got passed on. And men and women who had proclivities that didn't lead to successful reproduction, those proclivities disappeared. Now we live in a very unique time where now sex is separate from reproduction, but it never used to be before. And so all of our male and female habits are all designed around what are the things that are going to make me a reproductive success, despite the fact that in today's world, I could be swiped by every single woman on earth and I could just rely on birth control and be sure I never have a kid. But it didn't used to work that way. So what are the pressures? Well, for men, the pressure is really about access, because if a man can get access to more than one woman, he can in principle double, triple, or quadruple, as much as you want, his reproductive rate. Because for every woman that he is able to have sexual relationships with, he's got the probability of having one more kid. Whereas for women, she could have sex with 100 men in a year. She's still not going to have more than one child. And so men tend to be very interested in variety, and women tend to be much less interested in variety. Now, variety still matters for women. It matters more about, you don't necessarily want the same person to be the father of all of your children, because then you've put all your eggs in one genetic basket. Maybe you'd want a couple of guys who are smarter and a couple of guys who are more athletic, a couple of guys who are tall for when times are good, a couple of guys who are short for when you need to get by on not so much, But that's way less of a pressure on women than it is on men. And so on average, men are much more interested, they're more interested and willing to have sex quite rapidly than women are, and they're more interested and willing to have sex with lots of people than women are. And so that's a fundamental difference. But then if you look at what they're actually looking for in a partner, men, reproduction is hard for women. It's so hard that they basically can't do it anymore by the time they hit their 40s. I mean, there's exceptions, but 95% of human females have babies before the age 40 or not, no more after 40. So that means that it's very difficult for women to do that. It takes a lot of health. And so there's certain physical features that men look for, youth being a key one, that defines whether women are attractive to men, because that's their childbearing age or their childbearing abilities. Women, almost, the most desiccated old fart can probably produce enough sperm to inseminate a woman. And so it's way less important to them that they look at things like that. Now, there are still good genes in men. And so tall guys are a great sign of good genes. Tall is super important. There's lots of other things that matter too. Things like sense of humor. It's a good sign that there's more genetic expression in the brain than there is anywhere else in the body. And sense of humor is a sign of intelligence, a quick mind. And so women care more about sense of humor than men do, because they're looking for good genes in that sense. And if they're going to put all this effort into a kid, because it's a lot of effort for women to have a child, ancestrally, it was hard work to get enough food for the entire 9 months of pregnancy to keep the baby healthy. And then it's hard work to get enough food to lactate for 2 years in order to breastfeed the baby to keep it healthy. So women care a lot about resources, and they care a lot about good genes. And so a rich guy, a tall guy, and a guy who seems smart and fun and kind, of course, who will look out for them, who will take care of them, that's hugely important for women.
And it's also interesting if you look at the effects of cheating in relationships and how women and men react to that and what they care most about. So men seem to be more hurt by a woman having sex with another man, because it will turn into question who his offspring's father is, whereas women are more hurt if a man is fallen in love with another woman, because it means, well, maybe evolutionary speaking, that she's going to be left alone at her most vulnerable time.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In fact, it was David Buss, a wonderful evolutionary psychologist, who discovered this. And what's so interesting is it's a really nice example of evolutionary theory at work. When he started working on jealousy, there were no known sex differences in jealousy. Both men and women get jealous if their partner strays. And David was like, hold on. insemination's internal. Men should care about that a lot more than women do because they don't know with certainty that it's them. And women, they need a lot of resources to help take care of the baby. And so if man starts forming an emotional attachment with somebody else, maybe he'll leave. And of course, the data support that perfectly. Now, mind you, that doesn't mean the effect is 100%. It's not, it's about 2/3 of men tend to say, I prefer that she forms an emotional relationship than a sexual relationship with somebody else, and 2/3 of women say the opposite. So there's still a lot of variability within men and women about that, but you're absolutely right. Factors like that, where we've faced different evolutionary pressures over time, have a big impact on what we look for and what bothers us in relationships.
Should we look at everything pertaining to our experience in terms of evolution? Is that a productive way of looking at things?
Everything is probably too strong. And so we know that tons of things about us evolved, and often it's our most important things. They're often things that are what you might call species typical. Well, basically all humans like the taste of fat, salt, and sugar. And so that you can rest assured when you see things like that are species typical that they've evolved. But of course, there's lots of things about our modern world that probably didn't evolve. And in fact, what's interesting is when we get these mismatches, and we already talked about one mismatch earlier, where we used to live in a world where connection was guaranteed and autonomy was rare. And so we probably evolved to want autonomy more than connection, even though we need connection more than autonomy, because the thing that's rare, we want it all the time because we can hardly ever get it. Now, we see the same thing with lots of modern contrivances. And so I'm afraid of spiders. I'm a total wimp when it comes to them. And here in Australia, we have some pretty nasty spiders. And I remember I was visiting these biologists, and I was a speaker in their series, and then we all went out to the field station together, and we opened the box of groceries that we had brought out for the weekend, and this funnel web spider hopped out. That's the world's deadliest spider, and they're pretty aggressive too. And of course, the biologists immediately capture it under glass, and they're staring at it. And I'm like, someone's going to stomp on that damn thing, right? And they're like, no, are you kidding? What sort of horrible person you are? And they like flick it into the grass. And so I'm like sitting in this barbecue, at night with this deadly spider out there. I had the willies all night long. Now, no one's died of a funnel web spider, with the world's deadliest spider. No one's died of it since the 70s because every hospital has anti-venom, etc. In contrast, I don't get scared when I walk down the road, even though the smallest car could flatten me because the driver's eating a Big Mac and not looking at the road. But I've evolved to be afraid of spiders because they've been a threat since long before we were human, and cars are really novel. And so we know that sometimes our attitudes don't catch up with our world. And so there's lots of things about our world that are so novel that we don't respond according to how much of a threat or opportunity they really are.
I have a friend, his family's from South Africa, and he told me there was an advert on South African TV, and it was the water in the sea, and you'd hear the Jaws music, and then you'd just see the top of a toaster, and the whole point of it was that more people die in South Africa of toasters than of great white sharks, and it's just the effect of like Jaws that it's had on society.
And look at, I don't know if you've ever seen those wonderful videos that like the BBC or whoever make, where they show those great white sharks off the coast of South Africa eating the sea lions or seals as they swim across by these enormous death machines. And it's, of course, we're evolved to be afraid of that thing. That could kill us so easily, but they're rare and they don't feel rare. When you're out swimming, you feel super exposed. A toaster, this is safe. Let me get my toast out with my knife.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. Are there any obvious telltale signs in which that show that we have an imbalance in autonomy and connection that we can look out for?
I think there's a number of telltale signs. I think that, for example, we already talked about people moving to cities since the 1840s, and how 2/3 of humanity will soon live in the city rather than the country. But interestingly, if you actually ask how happy people are, they're happier in the country than they are in the city. And so we're doing things like that make us unhappy. When you further ask, well, do you know anyone you would trust with your house keys? Despite the fact that when you live in the country, far fewer humans are around you, the answer is more likely to be yes than if you live in the city and there's lots and lots of humans around you. And the reason for that, of course, is that we evolved to live in a world where we know everybody, because our ancestors always did. And that meant that we're repeatedly going to run into each other. I'm going to see you pretty much every day. And so I can't exploit you. I can't randomly do bad things to you because I'm going to see you again tomorrow. Your friends are going to be mad at me. The list is long. And so we had no choice but to look out for each other. But cities allowed the sort of exploitation by strangers. Not that it necessarily will happen, but it easily could happen. And as a consequence, we become rather distant from people. And so people report they're more satisfied with their friends when they live in the country than the city, even though they have many more choices in the city than they do in the country. There's lots of things like that that tell us there's something wrong. And it's not unfixable. In fact, it's very fixable. We just have to recognize that the problem is there, that we're sacrificing connection when we try to do these autonomy-oriented things, and then we need to start doing something about it. And so to take an example that's closer to home, we now spend less time with our spouses than we used to 50 years ago. And it seems, we don't know fully why, but it seems to be that recreation, there's so many opportunities now, we just go in different directions from them. And so the consequence is that each time you make that decision, here's my partner, we're sitting down to dinner together, this is a really funny, interesting scroll on Instagram, I'm going to do this now instead of talking to her. Yes, that might make sense the moment because she might not have anything to say that's that interesting right now. And you've got a great cat video you just posted that I want to see. But the cumulative consequence of that is that I become no longer as nicely attached to her and I'm wasting my time with your stupid cat videos. And so we actually suffer in the long term, even though every individual decision is defensible. And we're seeing that over and over right now, where people are constantly choosing not to connect when they should, even though that individual choice makes sense. The long-term cost of repeatedly making that choice is you feeling lonely.
I mean, I think we become so unconscious of these problems. I tend to, unless there's a trigger, I tend to notice this because I live right in the centre of Edinburgh. It's not exactly a big city, but it's busy, especially now. We've got the festival on. And I notice it when I go visit my parents who live in Fife, which is a very quiet, very small town. You could walk about 7 in the evening and maybe not even see someone. But if you do see someone, the done thing is to say hi to them and have a conversation. And I notice it when I go places like that, or go places up to the north of Scotland when it's just really quiet and it's some places where you just don't even see any buildings. And I feel it's almost like a craving to do that more. It's like I'm being drawn to these places, and I think that's why it's just my physiology or my psychology is drawing me to that sort of experience.
Yeah, and the thing is that you choose to live in Edinburgh because there's more opportunity. You can do the things that you want more readily. There's probably a lot better cafes. The list goes on. But that simpler, slightly harder, more Spartan life that you would live in one of these small towns would actually, on average, make you happier. It just doesn't feel like it, but it is.
What does evolution tell us about neurodivergent kind of conditions? ADHD comes to mind. Why is ADHD a thing? Is it the effect of the modern world, or has it always been a thing?
It's always been a thing, but it was unidentifiable in the past because people with ADHD they have poor internal control of attention. So you can think of internal control as what we call endogenous, where I say, I'm going to do X, I'm going to read this book, I'm going to watch the show, whatever. And exogenous is that external control of attention. And all of us have good exogenous attentional control. If there's something interesting going on, our eyes are drawn toward it. It's hard to look away. And whether you have ADHD or not, you can be great with exogenous attention. In fact, a lot of parents of ADHD children will say, no, I know my son is not ADHD. He pays great attention to his video game or to the shows that he likes to watch. He's just a slacker. Well, it doesn't work that way. He may be a slacker, but that's not the problem. The problem is that endogenous attentional control is actually really hard. Now, our ancestors were never, ever, ever required to do something that bored them. If you're starting to tell me a story that I don't want to hear, I'd ignore you. And if you're important to me, I'm not going to get up and walk away, but I'd start carving my arrow and pretend to be listening, but you're not going to quiz me on it later and find out that I wasn't paying attention. It's just not going to happen. And so in an ancestral life, you could have poor endogenous control of attention and nobody would ever know. Now, what does what are the positives of ADHD? Well, they tend to be lots of energy. They tend to be lots of fun. They shift easily from one activity to another, sometimes before they should. But there's as many pluses as there are minuses for that. If you don't live in a world where you're actually mandated to sit in school and let people bore you all day, but you pay attention anyway. That just didn't happen in our past. And so ADHD is a perfect example of something that would cause you no harm at all as a hunter-gatherer, but is actually a disaster if you have to somehow get through school unmedicated.
I think with ADHD as well, I've been looking more into it because I've pretty much become convinced I possibly have it. But I think the reason it's probably undiagnosed this long, I'm 29 now, is because I actually did fine in school, went to university, did fine at university. I think I did fine in university because I specifically chose things I was interested in. But if you looked at my grades in those specific subjects, if there was topics that I wasn't interested in, I didn't do very well. Topics I did do well in, I did very well. So it averaged out to look very good. So it's easy for these things to be undiagnosed if it's like that. If you're good at things you're very interested in, and not so much on the other stuff. And I think that's why I do this podcast as well, because I can zone in on this perfectly well for hours, but put me in, I don't know, a maths class. That was the perfect example, and I'm just not going to do well at all.
Yeah. And you're fortunate if you can find enough things that interest you in academics that you're going to come out okay. But a lot of kids who have ADHD aren't particularly interested in any of the subjects that are being forced down their throat. And so they never get the chance to go to university where they might have been fascinated by philosophy or geology or whatever might have been available, because they never got that far, because reading, writing, and the standard stuff that you have to do in primary and secondary school just wasn't of interest to them. And if it's not of interest, if it's not grabbing their attention, they can't force their attention on it in this particular case.
Yeah, and especially with school being so industrial or even Victorian still, the kind of it's going through the lens of classrooms sitting down subjects in which that is needed, and we're moving further and further away from practical subjects, woodwork and metalwork and things like that, and that's not going to be good for anyone, especially someone with ADHD who's not interested in those subjects where they have to sit down for hours on end.
Exactly. And we're seeing also very reliably now that girls are outperforming boys in school. They're better sitting still and doing things that might not interest in them. And they're more likely to go to university now. So we're seeing almost 60-40 across the industrialized world in ratio of females to males in university, which also is not good for a host of reasons. One of which you mentioned earlier, which is that in the dating scene, women tend to look for men who are more educated or the same, and men tend to look for women who are the same or less educated, and that ends up creating a mismatch. It worked great in the 1950s when men were more likely to go to university than women, because women often weren't even allowed. So I'm not saying that was a great situation, but that preference worked well then, and it's terrible now.
I mean, I did an episode with a men's rights activist. He has a blog called The Tin Men. And that, even though the majority of that, I'd say all of the conversation, we're not saying, we're being very objective with what we're talking about. There was some pushback, and I think that you're going to get that as soon as you start talking about men's issues. But I just think that benefits everyone. If women are looking for men that are similarly educated or higher educated, then we need to look at the fact that the education system is skewing now further and further towards girls, and it's great that more and more girls and women are higher educated, but it's a problem if it skews very far away from men.
It's not good for women. Don't like it when they're at college, university, because if they're heterosexual, there's not as many men there for them available for them to date, and society doesn't like it when you end up with these men and women who can't match with each other, men who feel like they're not of interest to women, and they're the ones who cause all the problems.
Do you think capitalism aligns with our need for connection and autonomy, or the opposite?
Yeah, so look, if you look at hunter-gatherers, they're the world's original communists. They were to each according to his or her need, from each according to his or her ability. And of course, that's this, this Marxist kind of credo that everybody puts in what they can and take out what they need. And that works really well when people have almost nothing. When you're living on the margins of starvation, people are really good about that kind of cooperative living because it's an insurance policy that everyone needs. But as soon as people start to accrue resources, it doesn't work at all. It doesn't fit our psychology. And so E.O. Wilson, the biologist, but the biologist who often studied humans, famously said, Marxism is a great idea, it's just wrong species. Communism is a great idea. We picked the wrong species, and because some bees and ants can do it really, really well because they have a very different genetic structure than we have. But so then, what's going to work for humans? Well, the advantage of capitalism is that compared to every other system we've tried so far, it generates the most resources, and of course, the rising tide lifts all boats. And so, we talk now about that there's a lot of inequality, or that lots of countries are being left behind. That's true. But if you look at the entire world, remember, we discussed earlier in this podcast, it used to be 90% of the world was in abject poverty when we were basically all farmers. Now 90% of the world is doing just fine. And 10% of the world is in abject poverty. That's not a good thing, but it's a whole lot better than 90%. And so it's been wildly successful. Now, I have to admit, I don't know what's next. And I wouldn't be surprised if we're not far from things like universal basic income and not even most humans not needing to work unless they want to. AI is going to change things dramatically. We're not far from a world in which energy is so inexpensive that we don't really need humans to work. And so it'll be super interesting what happens next, because, if you think back on the past, nobody ever asked a kid 20,000 years ago, what do you want to do when you grow up? Because everybody did the same thing. You hunt and gather. And now it's a big thing. What do you want to become work-wise? But I can easily imagine in 100 years, you only work if you want to. And what do you want to become is not necessarily a question about work, but what hobbies will you pursue? What social activities will you enjoy? We could imagine living in this world that's very different from now, where capitalism is kind of the past, but we're certainly not there yet.
What you mentioned AI there. What worries you the most about AI, and what do you think the most significant benefit of it is?
So what worries me the most is that if you look at the history of technological innovation in humans, what you can see is that a generation of people who did X for a living got screwed, and suddenly it could now be automated. And so you have a bunch of people who sew things for a living by hand, and now there's sewing machines and they're unemployed. You got a bunch of people who harvest by hand, and now there's harvesting machines and they're unemployed. And that story has been repeated many, many times. Now, every single time society got richer. And so if you look at what a dozen eggs used to cost, or a gallon of milk compared to a day's wage, they weren't that different from each other. And now it's trivial compared to a day's wage. So whenever you automate these things, you make them more accessible for everybody. And it's a net benefit for society. But there's a lot of people who got left behind, especially if it was a specialized skill and they've got it and now it's no use anymore. Now, that's the biggest worry going forward with AI, because in the absence of that world with universal basic income, and AI can maybe suddenly do most things better than we can, it's a little bit intimidating to think about what we're going to do. Now, with that said, I'm betting that we figure it out, and I'm also betting that it becomes as big of a plus for humanity as, the printing press and all these other forms of automation and mechanical success, whereby technology's actually made everyone's life better. But it could be that you and I are sitting on the cusp of having the bad timing that suddenly nobody will want whatever we've worked really hard, whatever talent we've worked really hard to develop, because AI can do it so much quicker and easier than we can. And it's interesting that this is also the first time that white collar jobs are likely to be really disappearing. The internet did that a little bit, but I think AI is going to do that a lot more. And so, people who've gone to university are now staring at their own skills and going, what that I've learned is of any value going in 10 years from now? And I have no idea.
Now, before we round this off, I'm seeing that we've went from daytime to nighttime where you are. Is there anything in your book, The Social Paradox, that people perhaps gloss over, or that you're surprised you haven't been asked about, that is also extremely important?
That's a good question. I think that I, I can't think of anything offhand. That's a great question. I wish I'd thought about that earlier because it maybe there is something, but nothing's occurring to me. I think that when I talk to people about the problem, I think it resonates. They realize that, but we really are spending a lot of time alone. There really is this fundamental tension, and the book talks about how it manifests itself in so many different areas of society, and it just kind of makes sense, just as it did to me. I didn't intend to write a book when I started it. So a student asked me a question about it. I was explaining how I think it works. They're like, "Wow, this is interesting. Where could I read about it?" And I was like, "Well, actually, nobody's written all this down." And they're like, "Oh, you should write a paper." And I was like, "Yeah, maybe I will." I write papers all the time. That's what we do as academics. And then I sat down to write the paper, and it just kept getting longer and longer. And I was like, "This is a book, not a paper." And so the ideas are just sitting out there, and for me, it was fun to kind of pull it all together. But I by and large, I think it resonates. It makes sense to people.
Hmm. Where can people go to keep up to date with your work? Where can people go to get the book, The Social Paradox?
So they can get The Social Paradox anywhere that people sell books. There's, e-copies and hard copies and audibles and things like that. Fortunately, it's starting to be translated into lots of different languages, so that'll be available. Just the other day, Ukrainian, and I was really touched because they've got so many big problems. The idea that they want to waste their time reading my book really made, it's heartwarming to me. And then of course I never used to be much on social media, but my publisher asked me to set up an Instagram account, and so you can see the things that I talk about and do there. And of course, if you're a fellow scholar, there's Google Scholar where all my academic works are sitting, and most of those are boring and inaccessible to most people because it's full of stats and that sort of crap. But the books are where I try to take the ideas that are interesting from there and talk about them in fun ways.
Perfect. Well, Bill, thank you so much for taking the time. I'll let you get on with your night. But yeah, thank you so much for taking your time.
My pleasure, Gregor. It's nice to chat with you.